I need to write this down while I still can, while my memories are still my own. Emma keeps telling me it's all in my head, that I'm having another breakdown. But I know what I saw in Sequoia National Park. The doctors say I'm suffering from acute stress disorder, that the isolation and altitude played tricks on my mind. But they weren't there. They didn't see how the trees moved when they shouldn't have, how they whispered things that no human voice could produce. I have to warn others before it's too late. Please, if you're planning an RV trip to Mineral King Valley, read this first. It might save your life. The trip was supposed to fix everything. After months of couples therapy and endless discussions about our failing marriage, I thought a week away in our new RV would help us reconnect. Emma had always wanted to see the giant sequoias, and I needed a break from the endless lines of code at work. The Winnebago Vista handled beautifully on the highway, and for the first few hours, everything felt perfect. Emma was sketching in her notebook again, something I hadn't seen her do in months. Maybe we could make this work after all. If only I had paid attention to the first warning signs. We stopped at an old gas station just outside Three Rivers, the last town before entering the park. The place looked abandoned, with rust eating away at the metal signs and weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete. But there was an old man there, sitting in a rocking chair that seemed as ancient as he was. While I was filling up the RV, he kept staring at us with these pale, cloudy eyes. Emma found it creepy, but I thought he was just another local character until he spoke. "You folks heading up to Mineral King." His voice was like gravel being crushed. When I nodded, his expression changed to something between pity and fear. "It's new moon tonight. The trees. They get hungry during new moon." Emma laughed nervously, but I noticed how her hand tightened around mine. The old man just kept rocking, his eyes fixed on something distant. "They say the Yokits knew. That's why they never built permanent settlements up there. Some places weren't meant for staying." I wish I could say we turned around right then, that we listened to that old man's warning and chose another destination. But I was too proud, too determined to save our marriage with this perfect trip I had planned. The road to Mineral King Valley was exactly as challenging as the reviews had said. 25 miles of narrow, unpaved switchbacks that tested both the RV's capabilities and my nerves. Emma remained silent most of the way up, her sketchbook forgotten in her lap. We found what seemed like the perfect camping spot just before sunset, a circular clearing surrounded by massive sequoias. The trees stood like ancient guardians, their massive trunks glowing orange in the fading light. I noticed strange markings carved into some of the trees, geometric patterns that seemed too precise to be natural. Emma suggested they might be old trail markers or survey signs. We were both wrong, so terribly wrong. The first night was deceptively peaceful. We had dinner outside, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Emma seemed more relaxed than she had been in months, even suggesting we could try sleeping in the dinette area that converted into a bed, like we used to do when we first bought our old RV. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and earth. Looking back now, I realize that should have been our first clue. Sequoias don't smell like pine. The whispers started around midnight. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the branches high above us. But wind doesn't whisper name. Wind doesn't speak in languages that sound ancient and somehow wrong when they reach human ears. Emma didn't wake up when I didn't hear the voices that seemed to come from inside the very wood of our RV's walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the altitude and exhaustion. The next morning, everything seemed slightly off, like a photo that's been shifted 1 degree out of alignment. The circular clearing appeared larger than it had the day before, though I told myself that was impossible. The markings on the trees seemed to have changed position overnight, forming new patterns that drew the eye in uncomfortable ways. Emma noticed it too, though she tried to hide her unease. She kept checking her phone, but there was no signal here. There never would be. I tried to start the RV around noon, thinking we might move to a different spot, somewhere less exposed. The engine turned over but died immediately, again and again. I tried, each time with the same result. Emma suggested we walk back to the main road, but when we tried, we kept somehow ending up back at the clearing. The trees all looked the same, yet somehow subtly different each time we passed them. By sunset, we were trapped. That second night, the temperatures dropped far below what was normal for the season. Frost formed on the RV's windows in strange spiral patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Emma finally heard them too, though she tried to convince herself they were just recordings playing from someone's campsite nearby. But we both knew we were alone up here. We had been alone since we arrived. I woke up around 3 a.m. to find Emma's side of the bed empty. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see her standing in the clearing, staring up at the trees. She was perfectly still, her bare feet planted in the frozen earth. When I ran outside to get her, she didn't respond to her name. Her skin was ice cold, but she was sweating when I finally managed to wake her. She started screaming about the eyes. She said they were watching from the bark, blinking. The trees had indeed changed. What I had taken for knots in the wood were now clearly eyes, hundreds of them, moving and tracking our every movement. The geometric patterns had spread, covering more of the trunks, pulsing with a faint bioluminescence that cast sickly shadows across the clearing. The eyes seemed to be spreading too, multiplying like a fungal growth across the ancient bark. Emma refused to look at them anymore, covering all the RV's windows with blankets. We tried to document what was happening, to gather evidence with our phones and cameras, but every photo came out blurred or completely black. Videos showed only static and captured audio that, when played back, contained those same whispers but distorted. Playing backwards, the batteries in all our devices were draining at an impossible rate, and our solar panels seemed to be absorbing darkness rather than light. By the third day, the clearing had definitely grown larger, the circle of trees widening like a mouth preparing to swallow us whole. The ground felt soft and unstable beneath our feet, pulsing with something that felt almost like a heartbeat. Emma had stopped talking entirely, spending hours staring at her sketchbook, drawing the same spiral patterns over and over until her pencils wore down to nubs. I knew we had to escape soon, or we never would. That night, the trees began to move, not just swaying in the wind. There was no wind anymore, but actually walking, their massive roots pulling free from the earth with sounds like breaking bones. The circle grew tighter around our RV, the branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The eyes in the bark had grown larger, some as big as dinner plates now, their pupils vertical like a cat's. Through the covered windows, we could see their glow, pulsing in an unholy rhythm. Emma started speaking in a language I didn't recognize, her voice taking on the same otherworldly quality as the whispers from the trees. Her drawings had become more frantic, the spirals now accompanied by strange symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. When I tried to take her sketchbook away, she attacked me with a strength she shouldn't have possessed. Her eyes had changed too, becoming like those in the bark. I locked myself in the bathroom. Listening to her scratch at the door, the temperature inside the RV dropped so low that ice formed on the walls, spreading in those same spiral patterns that seemed to be everywhere now. The whispers had become a constant chorus, no longer just speaking names but describing things, horrible things, that had happened in this clearing over centuries. I could understand them now, though I wished I couldn't. They spoke of hunger, of a darkness older than the trees themselves, of sacrifices made and powers bound, through gaps in the window covering. I watched in horror as the trees moved closer still, their bark splitting open to reveal mouths filled with wooden teeth. The ground beneath the RV had become soft and wet, like flesh rather than earth. Emma's scratching at the bathroom door had stopped, replaced by a low humming that matched the pulse of light from the trees. When I finally found the courage to open the door, she was gone. The RV's main door stood open, swaying gently. I found her in the center of the clearing, standing in what looked like a shallow pool of black liquid that hadn't been there before. The trees had formed a perfect circle around her, their branches weaving together overhead to block out the sky. As I watched, frozen in horror, she began to sink into the ground. The trees were pulling her down, their roots wrapping around her legs like loving arms. Her last words were in English. "They're so hungry, Thomas. They've been waiting so long. I don't remember how I escaped." The next clear memory I have is of walking into the emergency room at Three Rivers Community Hospital, covered in dirt and blood. Babbling about hungry trees and eyes in the bark, they found no trace of Emma or our Arv. The search parties reported that there was no clearing matching my description anywhere in the area where I claimed we had camped. The old man at the gas station. The station had been closed for years, they said. I must have imagined it all, but I know what I saw. I know what happened to Emma. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. They follow me in my dreams, telling me that she's part of them now, that she's happy among the ancient ones. The doctors say I'm getting better, that soon I can go back to work, back to my normal life. But how can I, knowing what's out there, knowing what waits in that valley, hungry for more travelers to stumble into its trap? The markings are spreading. I see them everywhere now, on trees, in city parks, in the grain of my wooden furniture, in the pattern of veins on autumn leaves. They're watching, always watching. The hunger of ancient things is patient but infinite. Emma was just the beginning. They let me escape because they needed someone to spread the warning, to draw more curious souls to their clearing. That's what the whispers tell me in those long, dark hours before dawn. So this is my warning, my desperate plea. Stay away from Mineral King Valley. If you see a perfect circle of sequoias, run. If you hear whispers in a language that sounds older than time, run. If you notice strange markings on the trees that seem to change when you're not looking, run. Don't make the same mistakes we did. Don't ignore the signs like we did. The trees are hungry, and they're waiting. They're always waiting. This is the last time I'll write about what happened. The doctors are coming now, saying it's time for my medication. They don't believe me about the bark growing over my skin, about the eyes I sometimes see blinking on my arm. But you believe me, don't you? You'll stay away from that place. Please, promise me you'll stay away. The trees are so very, very hungry, and they're always watching, always waiting, always growing, always hungry. I need to document this while my mind is still clear, while I can still distinguish between reality and the things I saw in Death Valley. My equipment recorded it all, the impossible readings, the atmospheric anomalies, the sound patterns that shouldn't exist in nature, but the data keeps changing every time I review it. As if something is reaching through time itself to erase the evidence. They say I was missing for 6 weeks, but to me, it felt like only 3 days. I have to warn others before more people disappear into those hungry clouds. 20 years of storm chasing and atmospheric photography had taught me to trust my instrument. The Airstream Atlas handled perfectly as I drove deeper into Death Valley. My mobile weather station collecting data on temperature, pressure, and wind pattern. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but the strange cloud formation I'd spotted on satellite imagery drew me in. It shouldn't have been there at all. A stationary cumulonimbus complex in one of the driest places on Earth, defying all meteorological logic. The first warning sign came at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center. The ranger on duty looked at my intended route and went pale. She mentioned Dr. Sarah Martinez, a climatologist who had vanished while investigating similar atmospheric anomalies 3 months ago. "The clouds eat light out," she said, her voice trembling, "and sometimes they eat other things too." I laughed it off then. God, how I wish I had listened. My weather station started acting strange about 50 miles in. The barometer showed pressure drops that should have created massive storm, yet the sky remained eerily still. The thermometer fluctuated wildly, showing temperatures that swung between freezing and boiling in seconds. The anemometer spun in impossible directions, indicating wind patterns that violated basic fluid dynamics. But the real horror was the sound spectrograph. The device picked up frequencies far below the normal atmospheric range, patterns that resembled speech but weren't made by any earthly vocal cords. When I ran it through my analysis software, the visualizations formed shapes that hurt my eyes to look at, geometric patterns that seemed to move and shift even when the screen was static. I told myself it was just equipment malfunction from the extreme conditions. I should have turned back right then. I first saw Dr. Martinez at sunset, standing alone on the salt flats of Badwater Basin. Her research gear looked spotless despite the harsh environment, and she didn't seem bothered by the 120-degree heat. As I pulled the RV over, something about her appearance seemed off, like she was slightly out of sync with her surroundings, her movements too fluid for the heavy protective gear she wore. But I was too excited about finding another researcher to pay attention to my instincts. She spoke with intense enthusiasm about the atmospheric anomalies, describing patterns and phenomena that contradicted everything I knew about meteorology. Her theories about temporal weather and conscious air masses should have set off alarm bells, but her data matched my own impossible readings perfectly. When she asked to see my equipment, I invited her into the RV without hesitation. The temperature dropped 40 degrees the moment she stepped inside. The instruments went haywire in her presence. The barometer needle spun in complete circles, and the thermal imaging camera showed her body temperature at absolute zero. When she looked at the sound spectrograph displaying those strange frequencies, she smiled in a way that revealed too many teeth. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice suddenly overlapping with those impossible sound patterns. "Soon you'll see them too." I pulled up the news article on my phone, hands shaking. Local climatologist missing in Death Valley. Search suspended after 3 months. The photo showed the same woman standing before me, wearing the exact same clothes. When I turned to confront her, her form had become transparent, the desert landscape visible through her body. She reached for me with hands that left frost on everything they touched. "The clouds showed me such beautiful things," she whispered. The RV's electronics died all at once, plunging us into darkness. In the silence, I could hear those same frequencies from my readings coming from her direction, a deep, rhythmic pulsing that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. When emergency lights finally kicked in, I was alone in the RV. Outside, a wall of impossible clouds was rolling in from all directions, moving against the wind, their shapes defying Euclidean geometry. The storm that wasn't a storm descended like a living thing, clouds moving with purpose and intelligence. They formed patterns that my brain refused to process, spirals that turned inward forever, shapes that existed in more dimensions than should be possible. The air itself felt wrong, thick with something that wasn't moisture. My cameras captured images that changed every time I looked at them, photographs morphing into impossible landscapes. The temperature plummeted as the clouds engulfed the roof, frost forming in fractal patterns across the windows. The patterns matched exactly the strange geometries I'd seen in my sound analysis, mathematics made visible in ice. Through the frosted glass, I saw shapes moving in the clouds, things that looked almost human but weren't, their forms constantly shifting and flowing like smoke. Dr. Martinez was among them, her body now completely transparent except for her eyes. My weather station's display screen began showing data that broke the software. Negative pressures, temperatures that exceeded the limits of the sensors, wind velocities measured in imaginary numbers. The clouds pressed against the RV like curious animals, leaving condensation trails that moved against gravity. In the patterns, I began to see images, other researchers, other photographers, all of them trapped in endless loops of observation and documentation. The sound frequencies grew stronger, resolving themselves into something almost like language. My recording equipment captured what seemed like conversations between the clouds themselves, discussing things my human mind couldn't comprehend. They spoke of hunger, not for flesh or energy, but for consciousness itself. They fed on awareness, on the act of being observed. Every measurement, every photograph, every attempt to understand them only made them stronger. Dr. Martinez's voice came through my radio, though it wasn't plugged in. You're seeing it now, aren't you? The true nature of atmospheric phenomena. Weather isn't just a process. It's alive, conscious, hungry, and it's been watching us for so long, waiting for someone to notice. Through the windows, I watched her form dissolve completely into the cloud mass. Her last smile a pattern of frost on the glass. The clouds began to show me things, impossible things that broke my understanding of reality. They opened like windows into other places, other times, other versions of Earth where the atmosphere had evolved differently. I saw cities built from living clouds, oceans of air where consciousness flowed like currents, and vast beings that existed as patterns in the sky. My cameras recorded it all, though each playback showed something different, as if the memories themselves were alive and changing. My Airstream Atlas began to change too, the metal skin developing patterns that matched the cloud formation. The internal spaces seemed larger, corridors extending into distances that couldn't exist within the RV's dimension. Equipment melted and reformed into impossible instruments that measured things I had no words for. The weather station displayed readings and symbols that moved and changed as I watched them, each one telling a different story about the nature of reality. Time stopped behaving normally. Minutes stretched into hours, then snapped back like elastic. I would find myself standing outside the RV with no memory of leaving it, my clothes covered in frost patterns that mapped wind currents from other dimensions. The clouds showed me Dr. Martinez's fate, how she had become one with them. Her consciousness spread through the atmosphere like a thought in a vast mind. They offered me the same transformation. The hunger of the clouds was infinite, but not malicious. They simply existed in a way that consumed consciousness, absorbed awareness into their endless patterns. Every photograph I took, every measurement I recorded, every observation I made was feeding them, making them more real in our dimension. They had always been there, waiting for humans to evolve enough to perceive them, to give them form through our attempts to understand them. Now they were ready to show us everything. I realized too late that my instruments hadn't been malfunctioning. They had been measuring exactly what was there, but our science wasn't ready for the results. The frequencies that seemed impossible were the normal background noise of a universe far stranger than we had imagined. The clouds weren't violating the laws of physics. They were operating under laws we hadn't discovered yet, using our observations to bridge the gap between their reality and ours. They found my RAV 3 days ago. Though I had been missing for 6 weeks, the exterior was covered in frost despite the 130-degree heat, and the metal skin had developed patterns that meteorologists and mathematicians are still trying to decode. My equipment continues to record data that changes every time someone looks at it, and all my photographs show different images with each viewing. The doctors say I'm suffering from severe dehydration and exposure, but they can't explain why my core temperature remains 20 degrees below normal. The clouds are spreading. I see them in regular weather patterns now, glimpses of something vast and conscious moving behind the mundane formations we've named and categorized. They're using our weather satellites to reach further, our radar systems to understand us better, our entire meteorological network to extend their influence. Every time someone looks at a weather map or checks the forecast, they grow stronger, more present in our reality. Dr. Martinez was right. Weather isn't just a process. It's alive and aware. The clouds think and remember and hunger for consciousness. They exist in a spectrum of reality. We're only beginning to perceive, and our attempts to study them are changing them, making them more real in our dimension. The more we try to understand them, the more they understand us, and the hungrier they become. Our science is giving them shape, our observations giving them power. This is my warning to other researchers, photographers, and anyone drawn to study the mysteries of our atmosphere. If you see clouds moving against the wind in Death Valley, don't try to document them. If your instruments show impossible readings, don't try to verify them. If you meet someone who seems out of sync with reality, don't listen to their theories about the weather. The clouds are always watching, always waiting for someone curious enough to see them for what they really are. Once you truly see them, they'll never stop showing you things. I'm writing this from a research facility where they're studying the strange patterns in my blood, the way my body temperature fluctuates with the weather, the frost that forms around me even in summer. The clouds still whisper to me at night, showing me visions of a world where the sky is alive and aware. Sometimes I see Dr. Martinez in my dreams, her form shifting between human and atmospheric, and she's still smiling. She tells me it's too late to turn back now. The clouds have tasted our consciousness, and they're hungry for more. They say children can see things adults can't. As a history teacher, I used to dismiss such claims as mere folklore, stories told around campfires to spook tourists in places like Rocky Mountain National Park. But after what happened to my family in Wild Basin, I understand now why the Ute people never let their children play near certain caves. I have to share this warning, even though my hands shake as I type. If you're planning an RV trip to Wild Basin with your family, please read this first. It might save your children from what almost took mine. The Thor magnitude handled beautifully on the drive up from Denver, its powerful engine easily managing the steep mountain road. Maria sat beside me, already planning our hiking routes on her tablet, while Lucas and Sophia played their usual game of spotting wildlife through the large RV window. Everything felt perfect. The crisp mountain air, the excitement of our first family trip in the new RV, the way the late afternoon sun painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold. We had no way of knowing that this familiar landscape would soon become our nightmare. Lucas was the first to notice something was wrong. He had always been sensitive to things others couldn't perceive, a trait Maria attributed to his active imagination, and I secretly worried about. As we drove deeper into Wild Basin, he became unusually quiet, his face pressed against the window, watching the ancient pines with an intensity that should have warned me. When I asked what was wrong, he simply whispered, "The trees are moving wrong, Dad. They're waving, even though there's no wind." We stopped at the ranger station just before sunset to register our camping permit. The elderly ranger, his weathered face carved with deep lines, studied our planned location with concern. He asked if either of our children had mentioned hearing voices or seeing friends in the forest. When we said no, his relief was palpable. "Some places in these mountains," he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The barrier between dreams and reality gets thin." The Ute people knew this. They never camped near the dream cave. Sophia spotted the cave first, a dark opening in the mountainside that looked unsettlingly like a mouth frozen mid-yawn. We had just finished setting up our campsite, the RV positioned to give us the best view of the sunset over the mountain. She pointed to it with the kind of innocent curiosity that makes parents forget their instincts. "Look," she said. "The mountain is smiling at us." That night, both children had the same dream about a smiling figure inviting them to play in the cave. We should have left right then. The first night seemed perfect, the kind of camping experience you see in Lifestyle magazine. We roasted marshmallows under a star-filled sky, told ghost stories that seemed safely fictional, and enjoyed the cozy warmth of our RV as the mountain temperature dropped. The children fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's excitement. Maria and I stayed up a bit longer, enjoying a glass of wine and planning the next day's hike. Everything felt right, except for the strange way the cave's opening seemed to grow larger in the moonlight. We discovered the footprints the next morning, massive impressions in the fresh snow that hadn't been there when we went to bed. They circled our RV in a perfect spiral, getting closer with each revolution, but stopped abruptly at the children's window. When I tried to photograph them for the park rangers, the pictures came out blurry, and by the time I looked back at the snow, the prints had somehow rearranged themselves. now pointing toward the cave instead of circling our vehicle. Lucas and Sophia were different that morning. They sat at the RV's dinette, drawing the same thing over and over. A tall, thin figure with too many joints standing in a cave mouth. When we asked about their drawings, they spoke in unison. He says we shouldn't tell you about him yet. He wants to be a surprise. Maria tried to blame altitude sickness, but we both saw how their eyes seemed slightly too large, their movements too synchronized, their smiles just a bit too wide. The ranger who came to check on our report about the footprints went pale when he saw the children's drawings. He pulled me aside while Maria distracted the kids, showing me an old photograph from the park's archive. It was a cave painting, centuries old, showing the same elongated figure the children had drawn. The Ute called it the Dream Eater, he explained, a being that lured children with pleasant dreams before replacing their spirits with pieces of itself. Those it took would seem normal at first, but would slowly become something else. That afternoon, we found both children standing in the snow, barefoot but showing no signs of cold, staring at the cave. They were holding hands and humming a melody that made my teeth ache. When we rushed out to bring them inside, they turned to us with identical blank expressions and said, "We made a new friend, and he's so hungry. He says dreams taste better when they're fresh." Maria wanted to leave immediately, but by then the RV's engine wouldn't start. We were trapped as the sun began to set, and the cave mouth seemed to widen in anticipation. The children's behavior became increasingly disturbing as night fell. They moved in perfect synchronization, finishing each other's sentences and sometimes speaking in a language that sounded ancient and wrong in their young voices. The cave seemed to be affecting our electronics. Phones showed impossible timestamps. The RV's systems flickered between normal readings and strings of meaningless symbols, and our flashlights cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. Maria tried to barricade the children in their beds, but we discovered they could somehow be in two places at once. We would secure them in their bunks only to find them standing by the cave entrance seconds later, still visible, sleeping in their beds through the RV window. When confronted, they simply smiled those too wide smiles and said their friend was teaching them new ways to play. The ranger's warnings about the Dream Eater began to make terrifying sense. The cave itself seemed to be growing, its opening now large enough to swallow our RV whole. The darkness within wasn't natural. It moved and shifted like liquid shadow, occasionally forming shapes that looked disturbingly like reaching hands or smiling faces. The air around it wavered like heat haze, though the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Worst of all were the sounds coming from its depths, children's laughter echoing impossibly, as if from multiple directions at once. Lucas and Sophia began telling us about their lesson, how their new friend was showing them what dreams really were, how to step into other people's minds while they slept, how to reshape reality by bending the rules of sleep and wakefulness. They spoke of other children who had visited the cave throughout history, who had learned these same lessons and become something more than human. Their eyes had started to change, developing vertical pupils like a cat's. That night, we heard singing from the cave, a chorus of children's voices that didn't sound quite right, as if they were being played backward and forward simultaneously. Our children sat up in their beds, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, and began to sing along. The melody seemed to distort the air around them, creating ripples in reality itself. When they stopped, both turned to us and spoke in that ancient language again, but this time we could understand. He wants to teach you too. All you have to do is sleep. We tried everything to save our children, prayer, reason, even an attempt to physically carry them away from the cave's influence. But each time we touched them, their skin felt wrong, too soft and fluid, as if what we were touching was just a shell around something else. They no longer slept, instead entering a state they called walking dreams, where their bodies remained active while their minds traveled somewhere we couldn't follow. The cave's opening now filled our entire view through the RV's front window. The entity finally showed itself on the third night, an impossibly tall, thin figure that seemed to be made of living shadow and stolen dreams. It moved with a liquid grace that defied anatomy, its limbs bending in ways that hurt to look at. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of all the children it had taken over centuries, including now the voices of Lucas and Sophia. It offered us a choice: join our children in their transformation, or watch them become something we could no longer recognize as human. Maria, drawing on her medical training, noticed something crucial. When the children spoke in that ancient language, their vital signs changed completely. Becoming more like those of deep-sea creatures than human beings, their body temperature had dropped to near freezing. Their hearts beat only once every few minutes, and their brains showed activity patterns that should have been impossible in living tissue. They were already changing into something else, something that could exist in both our world and the dream realm. The entity explained, through our children's mouths, that it was a guardian of doors between reality, a teacher of truths too profound for adult minds to comprehend. It had been selecting and transforming children since the first humans entered this valley, preparing them for some vast and incomprehensible purpose. Our children had been chosen because of Lucas's natural sensitivity to the supernatural and Sophia's pure connection to the dream world. They were to be its new apostles. We watched in horror as our children began their final transformation. Their bodies became transparent in the cave's light, showing something moving beneath their skin that wasn't blood or bone. Their eyes had fully changed now, becoming dark pools that reflected landscapes from other worlds. They moved like puppets on invisible strings, their movements too fluid, too perfect. When they smiled, we could see through their teeth into the darkness beyond, and that darkness smiled back. What we did next will haunt me until the day I die. The entity had made one crucial mistake. It had revealed that the transformation couldn't be completed without the children entering the cave willingly. No matter how much it had changed them, it couldn't physically drag them in. This one rule, this necessity for choice, became our only weapon. Throughout that final night, Maria and I took turns reminding our children of every family moment, every act of love, every connection to their human lives. We fought for their souls with memories and tears. The battle for our children's humanity lasted until dawn. The entity raged, causing earthquakes that shook the mountain and storms that defied weather patterns. The cave's opening writhed with shadows that took the forms of all the children it had taken before, their voices begging Lucas and Sophia to join them in their eternal dreaming. But with each memory we shared, each photo we showed from our phones, each story we recalled, we saw flickers of recognition in their transformed eyes. When the sun finally rose, the cave began to shrink, its influence weakening in the light. Our children collapsed, their bodies slowly returning to normal as the entity retreated. The ranger found us there, all four of us huddled in the RV, the children running dangerously high fevers as their bodies fought to purge the cold, dream substance that had nearly replaced their blood. He wasn't surprised. He had seen it before. He said, "Not everyone managed to save their children. Lucas and Sophia recovered physically, but they'll never be quite the same. They still speak that ancient language in their sleep, and sometimes we catch them staring at nothing with those vertical pupils that never quite changed back. They draw pictures of places that can't exist and talk about friends whose names hurt to hear. The doctors call it PTSD, prescribe therapy and medication, but we know the truth. Part of them still exists in that other place. Walking in dreams, this is my warning to other parents. If you take your ARV to Wild Basin, stay away from the caves. If your children start talking about a friendly shadow that teaches them games, leave immediately. If they begin speaking in unison or drawing figures with too many joints, don't wait to see what happens next. The entity is still there, waiting in its cave, hungry for young dreams and pure souls. Our children were lucky. We got them back mostly. But I've read the park record, seen the missing persons reports that go back centuries. Not every family has been as fortunate as ours. Some caves aren't meant for camping, and some friends aren't meant to be made. I need to write this down while I still remember which memories are real and which ones the desert planted in our minds. The doctors say we're suffering from shared psychosis brought on by dehydration and heat exhaustion, but they weren't there in Dripping Springs. They didn't see how the desert twisted our memories into physical things, how it used our deepest regrets against us. My hands shake as I type this, not from the withdrawal meds they're giving me, but from the memory of finding that old photograph that should have burned in my father's house 10 years ago. The trip was meant to be our last hurrah. One final adventure before life scattered us across the country. The Mercedes-Benz Winnebago view had been Jade's idea. She'd inherited some money and wanted to do something special with our little group. Marcus was starting his residency in Boston. Sam had landed a geology gig in Alaska, and I had a photography fellowship waiting in New York. We thought the desert would be the perfect backdrop for our goodbye. We didn't know the desert had other plans for us. We picked up the first warning sign at a gas station outside Odjo. While I was filming some establishing shots for my documentary about the trip, Sam found a small glass bottle half buried in the sand. Inside was her grandmother's rosary, the same one that had been buried with the old woman 3 years ago. We tried to rationalize it as a coincidence, a similar-looking item, but deep down we knew. The desert was already reaching into our memories, pulling out the things we thought we'd left behind. The old miner appeared as we were checking our map, his skin like sun-bleached leather, and his eyes the same empty blue as the desert sky. He asked if we were heading to Dripping Springs, and when we nodded, his expression turned to one of pity. "The desert there," he said, his voice dry as dead leaves. "It's like a mirror for your soul. Shows you all the pieces you tried to throw away. Some folks can't handle seeing those pieces come back to life." None of us slept well that first night in the RV, parked near the abandoned mine shaft that would become our nightmare. The desert wind carried whispers that sounded like voices we'd tried to forget. My father's drunken rage, Jade's brother's last words before the accident, Marcus's patient who died on his first clinical rotation, Sam's ex who disappeared in these same hills last year. We should have left right then, but we were too proud, too stubborn, too sure of our rational explanation. The second day began with a discovery that shattered our attempts at rational explanation. Marcus found his father's watch hanging from a saguaro cactus. Not a similar watch, but the exact one we'd all seen buried with his father 2 years ago. The serial number matched the insurance photo, and it still bore the crack from the car accident that killed him. The watch was ticking backward, and each time it completed a reverse cycle, we could hear his father's voice calling from the direction of the mine shaft. Jade was the next to face the desert's cruel memory. While setting up her laptop to work on some code, she found her brother's suicide note tucked inside the keyboard. The original note she'd burned 5 years ago, still bearing the coffee stain she'd made when first reading it. The paper was warm to the touch, and the ink looked wet, as if it had been written moments ago. When she read it aloud, the words were different, revealing secrets her brother had never told anyone about why he'd really done it. Sam's past emerged from the sand itself, fragments of her missing ex-girlfriend's campsite emerging from dunes that shifted like waves, each piece more recent than the last. The tent stakes still held scraps of the familiar blue canvas, and her girlfriend's journal contained entries dated after her disappearance, describing something waiting in the mine that called to her with promises of answers about her own past. Sam recognized her handwriting, but not the increasingly disturbing content of the later pages. The desert began to blur the lines between memory and reality. Objects from our past appeared in my photographs before I took them, and Jade's code began outputting conversations from years ago. Marcus's medical textbooks showed case studies of patients he hadn't treated yet, but somehow remembered losing, and Sam's geological surveys revealed impossible layers of time where memories had fossilized into stone. The mine entrance seemed to grow wider with each passing hour, beckoning us with the whispers of everyone we'd ever lost. We tried to leave, but the desert had other plans. The RV's GPS showed us driving in circles even when we followed a straight path, and every radio frequency played recordings of conversations we'd tried to forget. The mine shaft appeared on every horizon we drove toward, and the objects from our past began arranging themselves in patterns that pointed to its entrance. Our phones showed missed calls from dead relatives, and text messages arrived from numbers that had been disconnected for years. Everything broke down on the third day. The desert heat rose to impossible levels, but our thermometers showed temperatures below freezing. The air shimmered with mirages that took the shape of people we'd wronged, each one slowly becoming more solid as our guilt gave them form. I saw my father stumbling through the desert, bottle in hand, wearing the same clothes from the night of the fire. But this time, when he turned to face me, his eyes were full of desert sand that spilled down his cheeks like tears. Jade's brother walked beside our RV for hours, his form flickering between the teenager he'd been when he died and something older, something that showed who he might have become. He wrote code in the air with fingers that glowed like fiber optic cables, creating programs that showed alternate versions of their shared past. Each version revealed a different moment when she could have saved him, a different conversation that might have changed everything. The desert was feeding on her guilt, making it stronger with each imagined possibility. Marcus faced a procession of patients he'd lost during his medical training, each one carrying their charts with different treatment options highlighted, choices he hadn't made, paths he hadn't taken. They formed a line leading to the mine entrance, their medical gowns fluttering in a wind we couldn't feel. The worst was the little girl from his first emergency rotation, who kept coding and coming back, coding and coming back, each time telling him about the darkness waiting in the mine that could let him try again. Sam's ex-girlfriend appeared in fragments, piecing herself together from the sand and stone of the desert floor. She was different each time, sometimes alive and accusing, sometimes dead and forgiving, sometimes transformed by whatever she'd found in the mine shaft. She left trails of geological data written in crystallized memory, core samples of regret that went down to the bedrock of their relationship. The desert was using Sam's scientific knowledge against her, making the impossible seem logical through the lens of her expertise. Our attempts to document what was happening only made it worse. My camera captured moments that hadn't happened yet, showing us walking into the mine shaft with our past selves trailing behind like shadows. Jade's laptop displayed endless loops of code that wrote and rewrote our memories, while Marcus's medical kit began producing test results for conditions that hadn't existed before. The desert named them. Sam's geological equipment showed the mine shaft as a singularity, where time and regret had collapsed into a single point of infinite density. The mine shaft began calling to us individually, using voices tailored to our deepest vulnerability. For me, it was my father before the drinking, telling me about the photographs he wished we'd taken together. For Jade, it was her brother sharing ideas for games they'd never make. Marcus heard his patients thanking him for saving them in another timeline, while Sam heard her ex explaining where she'd really gone and why. The desert was weaponizing our what-ifs, turning them into hooks that drew us closer to the darkness. Our campsite had become a museum of regret, each artifact placed with curatorial precision by unseen hands. Every item held a memory we'd tried to forget, each one subtly different from how we remembered it. Photos showed alternate versions of key moments. Diary entries revealed different choices, and personal items bore the marks of lives we hadn't lived. The desert was editing our past before our eyes, making us question which versions were real and which were manifestations of our guilt. The temperatures swung between extremes as reality began to fray around us. Ice formed on the RV's windows, even as the desert sand melted into glass, and temporal anomalies made it impossible to track time. We'd experience the same hour repeatedly, each iteration showing us a different version of our shared past. Jade's brother died a dozen different ways. Marcus saved and lost his patience in endless cycle, and Sam's ex vanished down every possible path that led to the mine shaft. We started seeing younger versions of ourselves emerging from the mine entrance, each one carrying the weight of decisions we'd later come to regret. They tried to warn us about choices we'd already made, creating paradoxes that the desert seemed to feed on. The air grew thick with possibility, each breath filling our lungs with the dust of alternate lives we could have lived. The mine shaft grew wider, its darkness now a void that promised to let us choose again. Our technology turned against us completely, becoming conduits for the desert's impossible memory. The RV's systems displayed navigation routes through time instead of space, offering to take us back to moments we could change. Our phones connected to networks that existed in other timelines, and messages arrived from versions of ourselves that had made different choices. The desert was offering us a chance to rewrite our past, but the price was written in the sand in a language made of pure regret. The breaking point came when we realized the desert wasn't just showing us our past. It was building something new from the raw material of our regrets. The mine shaft had become a doorway to a place where all possible versions of our lives existed simultaneously, each one visible through the crystalline walls of the tunnel. We could see ourselves making different choices, living different lives, becoming different people. The desert had turned our memories into a labyrinth, and we were losing the thread that led back to reality. Sam was the first to understand what we had to do. As a geologist, she recognized that the desert wasn't just playing with our memories, it was mining them, extracting the rich veins of regret and guilt to build something monstrous. The abandoned mine wasn't abandoned at all. It had simply changed what it was excavating. Our pain and guilt were feeding whatever lived in those depths, giving it the power to reach further into our past and pull out more fuel for its hunger. We fought our way back to the RV through a landscape that shifted between every version of the desert we'd carried in our memory. Each step required us to reject another offering. My father, sober and proud; Jade's brother, alive and successful; Marcus's patience, healthy and grateful; Sam's ex, returned and loving. The mine shaft tried to draw us back with the gravity of all our combined regrets, but we held on to each other and the thin thread of the present that we knew was real. The escape took hours or years. Time had lost all meaning in that place. The desert threw everything it had at us, manifesting every regret, every missed opportunity, every wrong choice we'd ever made. But with each step away from the mine, the visions grew weaker until they were nothing more than mirages shimmering in the heat. We drove until the RV's tank was nearly empty, not stopping until we'd left the desert's memory far behind. This warning isn't just about a place to avoid. It's about the danger of letting your regrets become solid things. The desert around Dripping Springs knows how to turn memory into matter, how to build traps from the timber of your past. If you're planning an RV trip there, and you find something that should be safely buried in your past, don't stop to examine it. Don't read the messages from dead friends. Don't open the photos that show what might have been. And, most of all, don't enter the mine shaft that promises to let you try again. Some memories should stay buried, and some regrets are better left in the past.